The town council president points at the door and tells him they don't want his kind living here anymore. Thomas Reed, 62, former Navy SEAL, stands in the packed community center while 40 neighbors he's known for 5 years vote to force him out. His property sits on land they want for a new development, and nobody cares about the flag folded in his closet from his son's funeral. What they don't know is that 3 unmarked vehicles just pulled into the parking lot outside. If you stand with veterans who get pushed around, hit that subscribe button. Tell us in the comments about a veteran in your community who needs support. Now let me tell you what happened next. Thomas Reed loved his small house at the edge of Millbrook. Population 3,000. Quiet mountain town in rural Pennsylvania. He'd moved there 5 years ago after his wife died. Needed peace. Needed space to breathe. The little cabin sat on 2 acres with woods behind it. Perfect. He kept to himself mostly. Went to the hardware store once a week. Got groceries, said hello to neighbors. Nothing fancy. Just a simple life after 3 decades in the Navy. Then, the trouble started 6 months ago. A development company wanted to build luxury cabins on the mountain. Vacation rentals for rich people from Philadelphia and New York. Thomas's property sat right in the middle of their planned access road. They made him an offer. He said no. The land meant something to him. His son had visited him there before his last deployment. They'd sat on the porch talking about the future. 3 months later, his son died in a training accident. Naval aviator. 26 years old, Thomas. Couldn't sell, wouldn't sell. That land held his last good memories. The development company didn't like that answer. They went to the town council. Started putting pressure on. Suddenly, Thomas had code violations. His fence was 6 inches too tall. His driveway needed repairs. His mailbox violated some ordinance nobody had enforced in 20 years. Thomas fixed everything they demanded. Cost him money he didn't have much of, but he did it. Thought that would be the end. It wasn't. The town council called a special meeting. Mandatory for property owners in his zone. Thomas showed up at the community center on a cold Tuesday night. The place was packed, at least 60 people. He recognized most of them. Mrs. Patterson, who ran the bakery. Jim Morris from the gas station. Families he'd waved to for 5 years. The council president was a man named Douglas Vance, late 50s. Owned the local real estate agency. He'd been pushing hard for this development. His company stood to make serious money from the sales commissions. Vance called the meeting to order. He explained that the development would bring jobs and money to Millbrook. Put them on the map. Everyone would benefit. But there was one obstacle. One stubborn property owner refusing to cooperate with progress. He didn't say Thomas's name. Didn't need to. Everyone knew. Vance said the council had reviewed options. Eminent domain was complicated and expensive. But there was another way. An old town charter gave them authority to revoke residency for individuals deemed detrimental to community interests. Thomas's stomach dropped. They were going to kick him out. Just take away his right to live there. A council member named Sarah Chun raised concerns. She said this seemed extreme. They couldn't just force someone from their home. Vance cut her off. He said Thomas had been given fair offers. He'd refused to be reasonable. The town's future was more important than one person's stubbornness. Vance called for testimonies, one by one. People stood up. They talked about how the development would help their businesses, how their kids needed jobs, how Millbrook was dying, and this was their chance. Thomas listened to people he'd considered friends. The woman whose groceries he'd helped carry when her car broke down. The man whose dog he'd found when it ran away. None of them looked at him. Then it got worse. Vance asked if anyone had concerns about Thomas specifically. A hand went up. Doug Carver. Lived 3 houses down from Thomas. Carver said Thomas made him uncomfortable. Sighed he seemed angry, unstable, kept odd hours. Carver's wife added that Thomas never came to community events, never tried to fit in, seemed antisocial. Thomas felt his face burn. He kept odd hours because nightmares woke him at 3 a.m. He skipped events because crowds made him anxious after years of combat deployments. He lived quietly because that's what he needed to survive. Another neighbor said her daughter felt afraid walking past his property. Said Thomas looked at people strangely. Made her nervous that the lies kept coming. Each one adding to a picture of Thomas as some kind of threat. Some dangerous loner who didn't belong in their nice town. Vance called for a vote. All residents present could participate. The question was simple. Should Thomas Reed's residency be revoked for the good of the community? Thomas stood up. His legs felt weak, but he stood. He asked if he could speak. Vance looked annoyed, but nodded. Thomas told them he'd lived there peacefully for 5 years. Never caused trouble, paid his taxes, followed their rules. He said the real issue was that he wouldn't sell his land. This had nothing to do with community safety. It was about money. Vance interrupted. Said Thomas could make this easy. Just take the offer. Move somewhere else. Why fight so hard? Thomas's voice cracked. He said his son had been there. Those were his last memories of his boy. That land was all he had left. The room went quiet for a moment. Then someone in back said they were sorry for his loss, but that didn't change the town's needs. Others murmured agreement. Vance called for the vote. Hands went up all around the room. Thomas counted. 37 in favor of revoking his residency, 8 against. 3 abstained. It was done. Vance said Thomas had 30 days to vacate his property. The town would begin eminent domain proceedings. He'd be compensated at fair market value. He should consider this closed. Thomas stood there in shock. 5 years in this town. This was how it ended. Voted out like trash. His service didn't matter. His loss didn't matter. He was just an obstacle to their profit. He started walking toward the exit. The crowd parted. Nobody met his eyes. Sarah Chun looked like she wanted to say something, but stayed quiet. Thomas pushed through the doors into the parking lot. The cold air hit his face. He felt numb, lost. Where would he even go? Then he noticed the vehicles. 3 black SUVs parked near his truck. He hadn't seen them when he arrived. Didn't recognize them. The doors opened. Men stepped out. 5 of them. They wore civilian clothes, but Thomas knew immediately. Military. Every one of them. You could tell by the way they moved. The way they carried themselves. One man walked toward Thomas. He was about 50. Built like he still hit the gym hard. His eyes were familiar somehow. The man asked if he was Thomas Reed. Thomas nodded. The man said they needed to talk. Thomas asked who they were. The man said his name was Commander James Price, United States Navy. He'd served with Thomas's son. They'd been in the same squadron. He'd been at the funeral, but Thomas probably didn't remember. Too many people that day. Thomas remembered the funeral in fragments. Mostly a blur of uniforms and condolences. He asked what Commander Price was doing here. Price said he'd heard about the situation. Word traveled fast in the Navy community. When he learned what this town was trying to do, he made some calls. Gathered some people who wanted to help. The other 4 men came over. Price introduced them. 2 were former SEALs from Thomas's old team. One was a retired Master Chief who'd served 3 tours with Thomas in Iraq. The last was a Navy JAG lawyer. Thomas felt his throat tighten. He didn't understand. Why were they here? Price said Thomas had served 28 years, SEAL teams, multiple deployments, earned a Silver Star and 2 Bronze Stars. He'd trained hundreds of sailors who went on to serve with distinction. Thomas's son had been one of the best pilots Price ever worked with. The Navy didn't forget its own. The lawyer stepped forward. Her name was Lieutenant Commander Rachel Morrison. She explained that what the town council did was illegal. You can't revoke someone's residency without due process. The old charter they cited had been superseded by state law decades ago. Any attempt to force Thomas out would be challenged in federal court. Morrison said she'd already filed preliminary injunctions. The 30-day eviction was void. If the town tried to proceed, they'd face lawsuits they couldn't afford to fight. Thomas asked why they'd do all this for him. Price put his hand on Thomas's shoulder. He said because Thomas had given everything. For his country, his time, his health. His son, the least they could do was make sure he kept his home. The community center doors opened. People started filing out. They saw the vehicles. The men in their obvious military bearing. Conversations stopped. Vance came out talking on his phone. He looked up and froze. Price walked straight toward him. Asked if he was the council president. Vance nodded slowly. Price introduced himself. Said he represented Thomas Reed. He wanted the council to understand something very clearly. Thomas was a decorated Navy SEAL, a man who'd served his country with honor for nearly 3 decades. His son had died in service to that same country. Price's voice carried across the parking lot. Everyone was listening now. He said the attempt to force Thomas from his home was not only illegal, but morally bankrupt. He had friends in the Judge Advocate General's Corps, friends in Congress, friends in the media. If this town wanted to fight, they'd bring resources Millbrook couldn't imagine. Vance stammered, said it was just business, nothing personal. The town needed the development. One of the former SEALs spoke up. His name was Marcus Webb. He said he'd looked into the development deal. The company had promised jobs, but most would go to outside contractors. The profits would leave town. Meanwhile, property taxes would spike and force longtime residents out anyway. Webb asked Vance how much his real estate company stood to make in commissions. Vance's face went red. He said that was private business information. Morrison, the lawyer, smiled. She said it would become very public if they went to court. Discovery was thorough. Every financial dealing would be examined. Every relationship between council members and the development company. Everything. Sarah Chun, the council member who'd questioned the vote, came over. She said she'd felt pressured to go along. Now she understood this was wrong. She asked Morrison what the town should do. Morrison said simple. Rescind the vote. Leave Thomas alone. Find another route for the development or drop it entirely. That was the only way forward that didn't end in expensive litigation. Other people from the meeting crowded around. Mrs. Patterson from the bakery looked ashamed. She said she didn't know Thomas was a veteran. Didn't know about his son. If she'd known, she never would have voted yes. Thomas spoke quietly. He said he'd told them at the meeting about his son. They just didn't care. Jim Morris from the gas station stepped forward. He was a Vietnam veteran himself. He said he'd been afraid to vote no, afraid of going against Vance and the others. But he should have stood up. Should have spoken for Thomas. More veterans in the crowd identified themselves. 4 others. They'd all stayed silent during the meeting. Now they looked sick about it. Price addressed everyone. He said this was about more than just Thomas. It was about how communities treated their veterans. Whether service and sacrifice meant anything, or if it could be erased when convenient. He told them Thomas's son had died defending their freedom. Thomas himself had spent decades in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. The scars he carried weren't visible, but they were real. And this town had tried to throw him away like garbage. The parking lot was dead silent. Some people were crying. Others looked angry at themselves. Vance tried to defend himself. Said they didn't know. Thomas never talked about his service. How were they supposed to know? One of the SEALs, a man named Rodriguez, laughed bitterly. He said maybe they should have asked. Shown basic human decency. Not assumed the worst about a quiet neighbor who minded his own business. The third seal. Jackson added that Thomas didn't owe them his life story. He'd already given enough. The fact that he wanted to live peacefully in a home that meant something to him should have been enough. Sarah Chun announced she was calling an emergency council session tomorrow night to formally rescind the residency revocation. She looked at the other council members present, asked if they'd support it. One by one, they nodded. Vance stood alone, trapped. Morrison told him the development company should be informed. Their plans needed to change. Thomas's property was not available, not now. Not ever. Over the next hour, something shifted in that parking lot. People approached Thomas, apologized, veterans especially. They shook his hand, thanked him for his service, said they should have done better. Mrs. Patterson invited Thomas to Sunday dinner. Said she made a mean pot roast. Jim Morris said Thomas's next tank of gas was free. Other offers came, help fixing his fence, an invitation to the VFW hall. Small gestures, but they meant something. Thomas didn't know what to say. He'd felt so alone, so invisible. Now suddenly people saw him. Commander Price and his team stayed another hour. Made sure everything was clear. Morrison gave Thomas her card. Said to call if the town caused any more trouble. The legal protection was in place. Before they left, the former Master Chief pulled Thomas aside. His name was Raymond Cross. He said he remembered training Thomas decades ago. Thomas had been one of the best. A natural leader. A man who never quit. Cross said the Navy community looked after its own. Thomas wasn't alone. Never would be. If he needed anything, just reach out. There were thousands of veterans who'd stand with him. The vehicles finally pulled away. Thomas stood in the parking lot as the crowd dispersed. Sarah Chun came over one more time. She apologized for not fighting harder during the meeting. She'd been scared of the political fallout. She should have been braver. Thomas said he understood. Sometimes doing the right thing was hard. He didn't hold grudges. The next night, the emergency council meeting happened. Thomas didn't even need to attend. Sarah Chun called him afterward. The vote was unanimous. The residency revocation was rescinded and stricken from the record. The town formally apologized. The development company was told to find alternative routes or abandon the project. Vance resigned from the council 2 days later. The pressure was too much. His real estate company lost several clients. People didn't want to work with someone who'd tried to kick out a Navy SEAL. Thomas stayed in his cabin, kept living his quiet life, but it was different now. People waved when they saw him, stopped to chat, included him in things. The Vietnam vets from town started a weekly coffee meet. They invited Thomas. He went. It helped. He still had nightmares. Still had hard days. The grief over his son never really left. But he felt less alone, less invisible. The community that had tried to erase him now seemed to see him. 3 months later, Commander Price called, just checking in. Asked how Thomas was doing. Thomas said he was okay, better than he'd been. Price said good. Reminded him the offer stood. Anything Thomas needed, just call. Thomas walked his property sometimes. Stood on the porch where he'd sat with his son. The memories were bittersweet but precious. This land held pain but also love. He'd been right to fight for it. He thought about that night in the parking lot. How 5 men he barely knew had shown up to defend him. How the Navy community had rallied. How even his neighbors had eventually come around when confronted with the truth. Maybe people weren't all bad. Maybe they just needed to be reminded sometimes. Reminded that the quiet guy down the street had a story. Had given things they couldn't imagine. Deserved respect and dignity. Thomas Reed kept his home, kept his memories, kept his connection to his son. And he learned that even when you feel completely alone, sometimes help comes from unexpected places. Sometimes it takes a few good men showing up in black SUVs to remind a town what honor looks like, and sometimes that's enough to change everything.